Gary. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Although honored by your very kind invitation to be here this evening, I am more deeply honored by this opportunity to share with one another our love. Especially pleased to see my dear friend Ted here tonight. We haven't seen one another in many a year, but a dear gentleman. Out of curiosity, how many of you have been to Vicksburg? Just a few, and I think that they can attest to the beauty and grandeur of the place. Well, Vicksburg National Military Park was established by the Congress back in 1899 to commemorate the campaign, siege, and defense of Vicksburg. It was the 5th Civil War battlefield and set aside in perpetuity by the Congress, making it only the 7th national park. Today, we have more than 400 units of our national park system. And here in Vicksburg, we have one of the oldest, one of the largest, and one of the most heavily visited of our nation's historic sites. The park today encompasses approximately 1,800 acres, which is about 2/3 of the siege and defense lines around the city. But it's one of the more densely monumented battlefields in the world, currently boasting 1,380 monuments, markers, tablets, and plaques. And the monuments of stone and bronze that you shall see in the park were executed by the foremost American and European sculptors of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and have collectively made Vicksburg, in the words of one civil war veteran, the art park of the world. And that's a distinction of which we are immensely proud. Also in the national park are the grounds of Vicksburg National Cemetery. It is the largest national cemetery in the United States in terms of Civil War burials. Approximately 17,000 Union soldiers and sailors interred in the National Cemetery. Sadly, of that number, approximately 13,000 are unidentified. But of special interest to folks are the remains of the U.S. ironclad gunboat Cairo, which is currently displayed in the park. Cairo was an Eads ironclad, one of 7 sisters who supplied the Mississippi and its tributaries, gaining victory at places such as Fort Stanley and Donaldson, Memphis, and of course at Vicksburg. Well, the Cairo happened to be torpedoed and sunk in 1862. It went down in a matter of minutes without the loss of a single soul. The Cairo, interestingly enough, would sit on the bottom of the Yazoo River completely undisturbed until 1956, when it was finally discovered by our dear friend Ed Bars. Salvage operations commenced shortly after that, and in 1964, the remains of the gunboat were brought to the surface. It is now on display at Vicksburg. You can walk on the gun deck. Adjacent to it are the exhibit areas of the USS Cairo Museum, which has on display 1,000 random artifacts representing the 25,000 artifacts recovered from the gunboat. So it gives you wonderful insights into Navy life during the course of the Civil War. If I may have the first slide here, unfortunately it's rather small, but this is the geographic region we're talking about. Here is Vicksburg, located on the Mississippi River, exactly midway between Memphis on the north and New Orleans on the south. Biographer Lloyd Lewis fittingly describes the Mississippi River in the mid-19th century as the spinal column of America, the symbol of geographic unity. He refers to the great river as the trunk of the American tree, with limbs and branches reaching from the Alleghanies, the Canadian border, the Rocky Mountains. For more than 2,000 miles, the river flows silently on its course to the sea, providing a natural artery of commerce, and riding over the Mississippi's muddy waters from steamers and flatboats of all description, heavily laden with the rich agricultural produce of land and route downstream to New Orleans and world markets. The Mississippi River, then, as it remains to this day, the single most important economic feature of the continent, the very lifeblood of America. One contemporary wrote emphatically that the valley of the Mississippi is America. Well, upon the secession of the southern states, and in particular Mississippi and Louisiana, the river was closed to unfettered navigation, threatening to strengthen northern commercial interests. With the advent of civil war, President Abraham Lincoln assembled the civil and military leaders to discuss strategy for opening the Mississippi River and for ending what he termed a rebellion in the southern states. Seated around a large table, examining a map of the nation, Lincoln made a wide, sweeping gesture with his hand and placed his finger on the map of Vicksburg and said, "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." It was the president's intention that we can take all the northern ports of the Confederacy, meaning on the inland waters, yet they can defy us from Vicksburg. That means hog and hominy without limit, fresh troops from all the states of the far south, and a cotton country in which they can raise a staple without interference. Lincoln went on to assure his listeners that I'm acquainted with that region and know what I am talking about, and as important as New Orleans will be to us, Vicksburg will be more so. I trust you agree those powerful statements coming from the esteemed president, but they were no exaggeration, for you see, Confederate cannon mounted on the bluffs overlooking a large horseshoe-shaped bend of the Mississippi River at Vicksburg were not only trained on the river, but denied an important avenue of commerce to northern shipping. It's important to further note that Vicksburg was also the connecting link between the eastern and western parts of the southern nation, what Jefferson Davis referred to as the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. For as all of you know from your study of geography, west of that great waterway, the three states of the Confederacy, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, as well as the Indian territories that were both militarily and politically aligned with the Confederacy, fully one half the landmass of the Confederate States of America was west of that great waterway. And from that vast trans-Mississippi region came tremendous quantities of Texas beef and horses, sugar and salt from Louisiana, mules and sheep and hogs from Arkansas, lead from Missouri, what we would call today strategic commodities. All these strategic commodities would be funneled through Vicksburg and help support the armies of Robert E. Lee and Braxton Bragg operating much farther to the east. These supplies were absolutely essential to sustain Southern armies in the field and were an ever-increasing need by civilian population in want of sustenance. Coming from that area also would be much-needed food, clothing, medicine, and ammunition, as well as reinforcements of fresh troops. It was imperative for the administration in Washington to regain control of the Mississippi River, thereby opening that important avenue of commerce, enabling the rich agricultural produce of the land to reach world markets. It would also divide the Southern Confederacy in two along the line of the Mississippi River, sever those vital Confederate supply and communication lines, and effectively seal the doom of Richmond. To underscore the significance of the Mississippi River and of Vicksburg in particular, permit me to offer the following statements in support. William T. Sherman, a man destined to play a prominent role in the military operations we discussed this evening, wrote, "The Mississippi, source and mouth, must be controlled by one government." So firm was his belief that Sherman stated, "To secure the safety of the navigation of the Mississippi River, I would slay millions." On that point, I am not only insane, but mad. General in Chief Henry W. Howard wrote in similar, direct, albeit less eloquent terms, "In my opinion, the opening of the Mississippi River will be to us of more advantage than the capture of the 40 Richmonds." And finally, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, himself a resident of Warren County, of which Vicksburg is the county seat, and writing to Lieutenant General John Pemberton after the fall of Vicksburg, stated his view. "I thought and still think you did right to risk an army for the purpose of keeping command of even a section of the Mississippi River. Had you succeeded, none would have blamed. Had you not made the attempt, few would have defended you, of course." In order to protect the Mississippi River Valley, Confederate authorities established a line of defense which ran from Columbus, Kentucky, on the left overlooking the Mississippi River, through Bowling Green to Cumberland Gap, where the right flank was anchored on the mountains. On the Great River, south of Columbus, fortifications were also placed at Island Number 10 and on the Chickasaw Bluffs north of Memphis. 70 miles below New Orleans, two powerful masonry forts, Forts Jackson and St. Philip, stood guard at the mouths of the Mississippi River. Eager to confront the difficult task before them, Union land and naval forces moved with a vengeance from two directions in a giant pincer movement to wrest control of the Great River away from Confederates. Driving southward from Cairo, Illinois, were land and naval forces that seized Forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers in February of 1862 and opened the pathways of invasion to the Deep South. Continuing that drive southward, they gained victory at Shiloh in April, Corinth in May, and in June compelled the surrender of the Queen City of Memphis, and in the process destroyed the Confederate river defense fleet, opening the river all the way south to Vicksburg. Moving upward from the Gulf of Mexico were the ships of the West Gulf Blockading Squadron under command of then Flag Officer David Glasgow Farragut. Farragut's vessels bombarded and attacked Forts Jackson and St. Philip, and in late April compelled the surrender of the Crescent City. Now, New Orleans happened to be the largest city in the Confederacy, boasting a wartime population of 160,000. Nothing compared to the modern metropolis, and for many of you are familiar with. But to give you an idea of the size and significance of New Orleans, does anybody know what the second largest city in the Confederacy was? Sorry.
I'm going to say Richmond.
No, close. Charleston, South Carolina, population 45,000. So 160,000 in New Orleans, 45,000 in Charleston. Richmond, Confederate capital, 40,000. Atlanta, Georgia, 8,000. Vicksburg, Mississippi, the second largest city in the Magnolia State, 5,000 souls. And that was a combination of 3,500 white, 1,500 black, many of whom were free men of color. So you can see that the loss in New Orleans early in the war, was quite a blow to Southern morale. Conversely, it was quite a boost to the Northern morale. And with the initial success behind him, Farragut's squadron continued upriver. Baton Rouge fell to the Federals on May the 8th, Natchez, Mississippi 4 days later. And on the 18th day of May 1862, the vanguard of Farragut's flotilla arrived just below the fortress city of Vicksburg. At which time a skiff was lowered over the side of one of the warships, and under a white flag moved up to the city's waterfront, where demand was made for the city's surrender. But in terse words, that demand was refused. As Post Commander Lieutenant Colonel James Autry replied that Mississippians don't know and refuse to learn the meaning of surrender. Admiral Farragut thinks he can teach them. Let him try. Well, incensed by this response, Farragut's squadron opened a bombardment against the city. So on the 18th day of May 1862, we had the first hostile shot fired against the city of Vicksburg. The warships continued their bombardment. It was an intermittent bombardment from late May all through June and into late July, but to no avail. You see, the guns on these ocean-going vessels, due to the restrictions of their gun force, could not elevate their guns properly to draw an effective fire against the batteries of Vicksburg, which sat atop 300-foot high bluffs. Conversely, the guns on the high ground behind thick parapet walls of earth and mud could not depress their tubes sufficiently to draw an effective fire against the gunboats in the river. So although both sides hammered away at one another throughout the hot summer of 1862, there were very few casualties suffered or inflicted by either side. But by late July, Farragut's squadron, racked by sickness, plagued by rapidly falling waters in the Mississippi, and threatened to strand his ocean-going vessels, Farragut realized that he could not compel the surrender of the city of Vicksburg based solely on the might of his naval guns and withdrew to safer, deeper waters below Baton Rouge. It was then and there realized by both Union and Confederate high commands that if Vicksburg were going to fall, it would be in the hands of a massive combined land and naval operation. Now, the batteries which overlooked the Mississippi River, at that point in time, they were powerful, formidable. Most of these guns, upon the evacuation of New Orleans, had been brought by rail from New Orleans to Jackson, over to Vicksburg, and placed on the high ground overlooking the Mississippi River. And those guns would be in position when Farragut's squadron arrived. In light of the failure of the U.S. Navy, those batteries would be augmented by the addition of several additional guns. But all the land approaches to the city were open and thus vulnerable. And so the decision is made by the Confederate High Command to construct a line of defense that would bring the entire city, guarding all land approaches to the Vicksburg area, including the railroad access point. The responsibility for design of what became known as the rear line of defense would be entrusted to Major Samuel Lockett, the Army's chief engineer. Lockett was a graduate of West Point class of 1859, second in his class. He was a highly skilled and a well-trained engineer and set about his task with vigor. And any of those of you here who have been to the Vicksburg area can attest that as Lockett reconnoitered through the hills and hollows of Vicksburg, he realized that the city was a natural fortress due to its series of narrow ridges, discontinuous ridges, fronted and backed by deep, steep ravines, that Vicksburg was a natural fortress that he planned to make even stronger by the construction of field fortifications. The fortifications that would be designed and constructed under Lockett's supervision stretched for more than 8 miles around the city. It consisted of 9 major forts guarding all these road approaches, including the railroad access into the city. The flanks of this line rested on the Mississippi River, both above and below the city of Vicksburg. It would ultimately be manned by a garrison of 30,000 troops, mount 172 big guns, composed of major officers of the Union domination of the Mississippi River. Vicksburg would become known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and it would prove a very tough nut to crack. Late that same year, a two-pronged federal advance on Vicksburg met with disaster. Major General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Union Army of the Tennessee, had divided his forces in two for an advance on Vicksburg. One column under Grant's personal command, one column under Grant's personal command would move southward from his ranch in Green County, Tennessee, into North Mississippi. The object was to draw Confederate forces responsible for the defense of the Vicksburg-Jackson enclave into the northern portion of the state, there to keep them pinned, while the other column of his force under the command of General Winschel took advantage of Union naval superiority on the inland water, move rapidly downstream to Memphis, and hopefully attack a lightly defended city of Vicksburg. Unfortunately for Grant, as his army moved southward in late November of 1862, the monsoons hit. And in this region of the country, there's no such thing as a gentle, soaking, saturated rain. It always comes down by the bucketful. It's not that uncommon to get a 10-inch rain in a 24-hour period, which turned the roads into rivers of mud. The soldiers sank to their knees, the wagons sank to their axles. It was backbreaking, laborious work to corduroy the road and continue the southward movement. But as Grant continued his movement southward, his ever-lengthening supply and communication lines would become dreadfully exposed. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad, on which Grant depended for supplies, fell prey to raiding Confederate cavalry under then Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest. His advance base at Holly Springs also fell victim to raiding Confederate cavalry under Major General Earl Van Warren. Consequently, with the supply line cut, his advance base destroyed, Grant had no recourse but to fall back on Memphis. And this retrograde enabled Confederate forces utilizing interior rail lines to move from North Mississippi over to Vicksburg in time to thwart Sherman's strike north of the city of Chickasaw, Iowa. In reporting his action, Sherman simply noted, "I reached Vicksburg at the time appointed, landed, assaulted, and failed." It is perhaps the shortest battle report ever filed by an American military officer. Checked on the overland route, Grant seized upon federal naval superiority on the inland waters to transfer his army to Milliken's Bend and Young's Point, Louisiana, just upstream and opposite Vicksburg. During the winter of 1862-1863, federal forces dumped on tremendous quantities of food, clothing, medicine, ammunition, and countless other items for the spring campaign aimed at Vicksburg. Grant also orchestrated a series of illustrated bio-campaigns, the object of which was to get on the same side of the river as the Confederates defending Vicksburg, or on high, dry ground to put his army in motion and his artillery to use. But all of these experiments, as Grant called them, ended in dismal failure, and only resulted in an ever-lengthening casualty list. After months of frustration and failure, Grant was at a crossroads in his military career. There was tremendous clamor in the northern press to remove him from command. Even members of the cabinet, most vocal of whom was the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, himself in Ohio, as was Grant, demanded that Grant be replaced as commander of the Western Army. But the president responded to those critical of Grant by saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights. I'll try him a little longer." Well, cognizant of the criticism swirling around his name in both political and military circles, Grant remained focused on his objective, yet he expressed a corner and felt in private letters to his wife, Julia. By the spring of 1863, only 3 options are left to Grant. The first was to launch a direct amphibious assault across the Mississippi River and storm the Vicksburg stronghold. But as Grant stood on the west side of the river, looking over a mile-wide river with a very fast current, gazing up at these 300-foot-high bluffs, primed with cannon, glistening with bayonets, Grant realized that if such a move could succeed, it could only succeed at a very high cost in human life. Now, although Grant comes down to us in popular history as a butcher, a man who's willing to read his scriptures, I can assure you that Grant was very cognizant of the lives of his soldiers. He would not waste them needlessly. In Grant's mind, this simply would cost too many men, and he was not willing to pay the butcher's tab. The second option was to fall back to Memphis and try that overland route once again. And this would be the option recommended by his most trusted subordinate officers, his 2 West Point trained Corps Commander, Sherman and James McPherson. But Grant, by this stage of the war, had become very astute politically. And he realized that to fall back from immediate proximity of Vicksburg, back 200 river miles all the way up to Memphis, regardless of the reason, would be construed as an admission of defeat. And what happened to defeated Union generals during the Civil War? I'll tell you what. Lincoln changed his generals almost as frequently as he changed his shirts. In Grant's mind, the only viable option left was to move his army from its base camps at Milliken's Bend and Young's Point, Louisiana, down the west side of the river and search for a suitable crossing point of the Mississippi somewhere below Vicksburg. Now, for this to succeed, he's going to need the cooperation of the United States Navy, and in this case, the Mississippi Squadron under the command of Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter. Now, in the early years of the Civil War, the inland water and groundwater Navy was under Army control, and we're going to call a lot of naval officers, big orders in the But Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wells, finally impressed upon President Lincoln that this inland water Navy deserved and needed to be under naval control, and so Lincoln authorized it. And so now it became a peer, an equal, if you will. Grant, the general, could no longer order admirals such as Porter around. He could only request assistance. And it would be the admiral's right to turn down that request if he felt his fleet was in too grave a danger. Fortunately, these 2 men got along very well. They worked together for many months prior to the Vicksburg operation. But you can imagine when Grant first approached Admiral Porter with the idea of launching gunboats, army transports past the powerful batteries of Vicksburg, past it, deemed impossible by many. Porter was aghast at the mere suggestion. But he realized Grant was serious. And so he told Grant, "Think long and hard about this, General. If that's what you need me to do, I'll make the attempt. Just bear in mind that once my fleet is below the batteries of Vicksburg, if it gets there, it will never come back upriver." Or you see, going downstream with that powerful current, the gunboats can make about 6 knots, roughly 6 miles an hour. But coming upstream against that powerful current, they can only make 2 knots, or 2 miles. Thus, to be under Confederate shore fire for a prolonged period of time, and it was believed that not even the powerful ironclads, which, by the way, had wooden roofs and skylights for interior illumination and ventilation, could withstand the shelling that would be hurled at them by elevated batteries. So Porter cautions me. Think long and hard about this. That's what you need to do. I'll make the attempt. Grant examined his options and came back to Admiral Porter and said, "Admiral, this is the only viable option left us. It must be done." And so with Porter's buy-in to this Grant scheme, Grant would finally reveal his plan to his own subordinate officer, Sherman McPherson. and be untrue. By the way, this 2 West Point train and Corps command were violently opposed to this plan, so much so that they both put their opposition in writing. And as they ran forward, there were letters of opposition to the Secretary of War. Grant simply pocketed those letters of opposition. Well, the dark, moonless night of April the 16th would be selected for passage of the batteries. The Army, by the way, had already begun its movement. Grant issued his orders on March 29th of 1863 to begin this movement southward through Louisiana. 2 days later, the movement began, and thus the Vicksburg campaign began in earnest. As Grant's soldiers were slogging their way southward through Louisiana, corduroying roads and building bridges practically each step of the way, completely prepared to run the batteries. As mentioned, the dark, moonless night of April 16th is selected for the attempted passage. And so early that morning, the fires were lit, so that by nightfall they were burning hot and clean, not leaving telltale plumes of smoke and sparks emanating from their stacks. All the gunboats would be painted black and running like a big thing. Bales of hay, bales of cotton, and pipes around the Indians to muffle their sound. Around 11 o'clock that night, the Porter gave the order. The anchors were raised and the gunboats drifted out into the channel. And in single file, drifting with the current, they would round the DeSoto Point. Unbeknownst to Admiral Porter, however, was each and every night the Confederates placed scouts out in skiffs at the head of DeSoto Point to guard against and uncover any attempt by the U.S. Navy to run by the batteries of Vicksburg. And close around midnight, the scouts out in these small skiffs saw these huge dark shapes sweeping down toward them. They quickly made them out to the Union gunboats and transport vessels. Had to spread the alarm, and so they rode to either side of the Mississippi River, where already barrels of tar, bales of cotton soaked in turpentine had been placed. And so the fires are lit, not only on the Mississippi side, but on both sides, not only to illuminate the river, but to silhouette the Union fleet as it attempted the passage of the battery. Well, as Porter in the lead vessel of Benton, rounding the DeSoto Point, he passes by the powerful water battery, battery number 1 in line. No movement is seen, no sound is heard. He continues downstream, passing battery number 8. No movement is seen, no sound is heard. And Porter's hopes begin twice a week. We're going to pass by these batteries undetected. But suddenly the night sky is ablaze, and shortly after that, the dull boom of the heavy guns could be heard. Realizing that his squadron had been spotted, Porter sends up the signal flags for all the vessels to get up a full head of steam and run by these batteries just as fast as they can go. As they're hugging the Louisiana shore, the shoreline opposite Vicksburg, Porter pays very close attention to where the shot and shell are hitting his vessels, and he notices they are hitting his smokestacks, his pilot houses and wheelhouse. Some are hitting the hurricane deck, a few are getting down to the gun deck, but virtually none are getting any lower to where the vital parts of the boats were located, engines, steam pumps, and much and so on. And Porter realized there must be a fatal flaw in the placement of their batteries. Here's Porter, then one word. I was lose track of these slides.
Yeah.
Here's the passage of the batteries on the night of the 16th. Porter realizes there must be a fatal flaw in the placement of these batteries, preventing the Confederates from depressing their tubes sufficiently to draw an effective fire on the gunboats in the river. And when it comes to that realization, he realizes the closer you get to these guns, the safer you're going to be. So he hoists the signal for all of his vessels as they round the DeSoto Point, move across the current out of the Mississippi shore, get as close to these guns as possible. Now, first, the pilots and captains of these trailing vessels thought they had misinterpreted the flag. Sure enough, the Benton moving across the current. They would follow suit. So close would they come to the Mississippi shoreline that Union sailors reported hearing the commands being given by Confederate gun captains. They could also hear bricks tumbling in the city streets, the effect of their own shell fire. Well, after several fires of extending ship-to-shore fire, the last vessel had passed the southernmost battery. Porter tallied his losses and realized that although every vessel had been hit and hit repeatedly, only one unmanned transport vessel came into play and then sunk. The impossible had been achieved. Now, with the fleet below Vicksburg, Grant would have the wherewithal to cross the mighty river. It was Grant's intention to force a crossing the river at Grand Gulf, located about 30 river miles south of Vicksburg. There was a good all-weather landing, and from which point roads radiated deep into the interior of Mississippi. But the landing was guarded by two powerful forts, Forts Covert and Fort Wade. On April the 29th, Grant requested Admiral Porter to once again put his gunboats into action to engage these shore batteries. And so at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 29th day of April, Porter's gunboats went into action. For 6 hours, they exchanged ship-to-shore fire with Confederate river batteries. They managed to silence the guns at Fort Wade, but could not silence those off Fort Covert. And ever adapted, let there be no doubt in your mind that was Grant's true strength as a battle captain. Ever adapted, Grant would simply disembark his invasion force, march them 5 miles farther down the natural levee, have Porter's gunboats run by the batteries of Grand Gulf that evening, and rendezvous with him once again at Dishelroon Plantation. From Dishelroon Plantation on April 30th, Porter's gunboats and transport vessels would transfer Grant's army across the Mississippi River and onto Mississippi soil. It was the largest amphibious operation in American military history up to that time, and remains so all the way until November 1942, in Operation Torch during the Second World War. And in this movement, Grant would transfer 24,000 foot soldiers, 60 pieces of artillery across the Mississippi River and begin the inland campaign to capture Vicksburg. Once ashore, Grant's forces pushed rapidly inland and marched through the course of the night. In the early morning hours of May 1st, Confederate resistance was encountered west of Fort Gibson. In a furious battle which raged throughout the day, Union soldiers fought with grim determination to secure their beachhead on Mississippi soil, while Confederate soldiers fought with equal determination to drive the invaders back into the Mississippi River. But by day's end, Confederate forces, outnumbered and hard-pressed, retired from the field. Rather than march directly on Vicksburg, here's a Grand Gulf, by the way. Here's Roseburg, where his army trained to be short. Here's the Battle of Fort Gibson. Rather than march north directly to Vicksburg, Grant ordered his army in a northeasterly direction. It was his intention to get astride this railroad connecting Vicksburg to Jackson and via Jackson points elsewhere in the Confederacy. That was John Pemberton's, the Confederate commander's, line of supply and communication. That's his lifetime. Grant wanted to get astride that railroad, destroy it in detail, then turn west on Vicksburg and isolate his opponent in the Hill City. Over the next 17 days, in what is often referred to as the Blitzkrieg of the Vicksburg Campaign, Grant's army would push deep into the interior of Mississippi, marching more than 200 miles, meeting and engaging Confederate resistance in 5 separate actions. Here at Fort Gibson on May the 1st, on May the 12th, in the Battle of Raymond. 2 days later, he would capture the capital city of Jackson. Not wishing to waste combat troops on occupation of Mississippi's capital city, Grant would order Mississippi's capital city neutralized militarily. And by that I mean they destroyed anything in military value. Machine shops were set afire, telegraph lines cut, railroad tracks destroyed. Again, anything in military value was destroyed. With Jackson now effectively neutralized, Grant would turn west toward his objective, toward the city of Vicksburg, and the route between Jackson and Vicksburg, he would encounter the Confederate Army of Vicksburg under the personal command of Lieutenant General John Pemberton near the village of Taylor Station. Here on May the 16th, what was the largest, bloodiest, and most significant action of this campaign, Grant's army would rout the Confederates from the field at Champion Hill, drive them in panic and confusion back toward the city of Vicksburg. The next day, and following up his success, he would rout the Confederate rear guard here along the line of Big Black River and drive them back into the city's defenses. The campaign thus far had been a stunning success for Union forces. Grant's forces had overcome the Confederate resistance in those 5 actions. Lieutenant General John Pemberton, badly shaken by the defeat at Champion Hill and at Big Black River Bridge on May 17th as he fell back on Big Black River, he would ride by himself, abandoning his army in the field. The Army's chief engineer, Major Samuel Lockett, after setting fire to the bridges across the river, would ride hard to join up with Pemberton. He said it was the most painful ride of his life. The 2 men rode in abject silence. Pemberton, his head bowed, dejected. Suddenly, the commanding general spoke up and without directing his words toward anyone in particular, he said, "Just 30 years ago, I began my military career by accepting a cadetship at the U.S. Military Academy. And today, that same day, that career is ended in disaster and disgrace." And for all intents and purposes, it was. But it was a disaster and a disgrace that would recall an entire nation. The citizens of Vicksburg watched in fear as the shattered remnants of Pemberton's army poured into the city on that fateful day. Mrs. Emma Balfour, resident of Vicksburg, stood in the doorway and watched as this mass of humanity fell back into the cities and recorded for posterity the scenes by which she was involved. As she wrote, "From 12 o'clock until late midnight, the streets and roads were jammed with all that appertains to an army. Men, horses, wagons, cattle, stock, sheep, all being brought hurriedly within the entrenchment at Vicksburg. She observed that hundreds of men had no weapons. Entire batteries had been abandoned in the fields at Champion Hill and along the line of the Big Black River. Well, was this demoralized mass of humanity that would fall back into the city's defense and assume a position in the defense line and there await the onslaught that they knew would surely follow? And late that night, Mrs. Balfour recorded in the pages of her diary the fears of many in Vicksburg as she wrote, "What is to become of all the living things in this place, shut up as in a trap? Only God knows." Well, over the next 6 hot, muggy Mississippi weeks, Mrs. Balfour would experience firsthand what would happen to all living things in Vicksburg. On through the long day and into the evening marched the armies clad in butternut and gray. Simply or in small groups, with no sense of order or discipline, the men plowed into the rifle pits and turned eastward to meet Grant's rapidly approaching army. A medley of sounds filled the night air as Confederates readied their defenses. Officers shouted orders, teamsters whipped their animals and dragged artillery into position. And as the soldiers worked with pick and shovel, some men cursed while others prayed. Throughout the night, the ringing of axes was constant as additional trees were felled to strengthen their fortifications, clear fields of fire, and form abattis of felled trees in their front. Work continued at a feverish pace, and by sunrise, the city was in a good state of readiness. For those of you not familiar with abattis, abattis is a French term for obstruction. It's simply trees toppled toward likely avenues of enemy approach. All those branches are intertwined. They are then stripped and sharpened, and an entanglement and telegraph wire sprung in front of those fallen limbs. The purpose of abattis is twofold. One, obviously, to disrupt approaching lines of enemy, or give the Union Army in its assaults against the city advanced in the conventional format of the time period, with man touching man, 2 ranks deep. All along their front, they would encounter this obstruction of felled trees. If they tried to maintain their alignment, being the center for command and control of their forces, many of these soldiers are going to trip over that entanglement of wire and impale themselves on these sharpened limbs. At best, they'd only be able to filter through singly and in small groups, and once on the other side of the obstruction, now in a clear field of fire, singly or in small groups, they would be easy targets for the Confederate riflemen posted behind the south fortifications of Vicksburg. The other objective of abattis is to channel enemy assault bomb into what the modern army calls their kill zone. We will find out that the abattis serve its purpose quite well here at Vicksburg. On the 18th day of May, the Confederates anxiously awaited the arrival of the Union Army, and one Confederate soldier located in the stockade dam just northeast of the city witnessed. Late in the afternoon, as the second sun cast lurid shadows over the field, there was a flurry of activity to the front. Inside the musketry heralded the arrival of the Union Army. As we gazed over our parapets and into the distance, we caught sight of the enemy columns approaching Vicksburg. Their columns extended as far as the eyes could see. Their battle flags blew in the breeze above them. The bayonets just glistened in the sunlight. And onward they came, a powerful host indeed. Well, the powerful host would arrive and extend its lines around the city. This is Lieutenant General John Pemberton, Confederate command. By the way, he's a Pennsylvanian by birth. Married a Southern woman from Norfolk, Virginia. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, Patty Pemberton would write to her husband, "Why are you not with us? President Davis has a position for you." Well, Pemberton, unwilling to take up his sword against his wife's family, would reluctantly resign his commission in the Army of the United States and offer his sword to her in the state of Virginia. And by this stage of the war, he has risen to the rank of lieutenant general, the equivalent of a modern 3-star rank, and be in command of the all-important Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. Here you see the Confederate defense line remaining in the city of Vicksburg. It's referred to as the rear line of defense. So the river batteries from the Mississippi River here at Central Point, and here is the rear defense line. Grant was anxious for a quick victory. After all, his forces had defeated Confederates in 5 separate actions thus far. He believed the Confederates' response before the defense of Vicksburg was greatly demoralized and thought that an early show of force would result in a speedy capitulation of the city. So he ordered an attack on May the 19th. Unfortunately for Grant, of his 3 Army corps, only 1 corps, known as Sherman's Corps here northeast of the city, would be in proper position for the attack. Sherman, realizing that his troops would be unsupported, would make preparations accordingly. Early in the morning of the 19th day of May, Union artillery opened fire. For several hours, they bombarded the Confederate works with solid shot and shell, tearing large holes in the earthen fortifications, the thick white blue smoke of the guns completely shrouding the fields. When the guns fell silent, that was a signal for the infantry to advance. Pouring out of our now dense wooded ravines that would have been clear at that point in time, the Federals deployed to strike Graveyard Road, known as Graveyard Road, not due to the heavy battle casualties that occurred in this area, but simply due to that the city cemetery is located along that road, Cedar Hill Cemetery, which to this date is the largest municipally owned active cemetery in the United States. Sherman's forces were deployed astride the Graveyard Road and moved forward. Although they would succeed in planting their colors on the superior slopes of the Confederate fortifications, they would be driven back with heavy loss. On this particular day, assaulting on the Graveyard Road there on the north side of it would be the troops of the 1st Battalion, 13th United States Infantry, one of only 2 regular Army units with Grant. The rest of these troops are all volunteer troops, hence their regiments had state designations, such as the 20th Ohio, the 37th Illinois, and so on. The regulars were your professional soldiers, noted for their discipline, their esprit de corps, and here at Vicksburg, the paucity of their numbers testifies to their heavy casualties on previous fields of battle. The commander of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry was no less an individual than Captain Edward Washington, grandnephew of George Washington himself, West Point grad from Pennsylvania. Well, all eyes turned to the regulars to see how they would perform. As Captain Washington deployed his troops in line of battle, one Confederate soldier gazing over the parapet said, "We watched as the enemy formed for the assault. Man touching man, rank pressing rank in line supporting line. We watched as their officers rode up and down the lines, giving encouragement to their men, making sure that all was set for the advance. We watched as they uncased their colors, which caught the breeze above them, and listened to the sound of cold steel as they fixed their bayonets in preparation for the assault." Well, as the regulars moved across the field, there was a post and rail fence blocking their way. Captain Washington would order men forward to remove the rails, knock down the post. Mind you, it was very stout post and rail fence, and they were unable to disassemble the fence. So as this line of battle approached the fence line, they came to a halt, only 200 yards from the Confederate works. The Confederates rose in mass, and there was a withering volley of musketry, toppling scores of these soldiers. Those who were unharmed broke rank, clambered over the fence, and slid down into the valleys, began filtering their way through the dense obstruction of felled trees. 17 men would be killed and mortally wounded, carrying the national colors of the 1st Battalion forward that day. But as the colors fell to the ground, each time they were picked up and carried forward, ever forward. Finally, Captain Charles Ewing, brother-in-law of William T. Sherman, second in command of the battalion, grabbed the flag, and as he was flying his way up the opposite slope toward the Confederate line, he was winded. And so he sat on the stump of a tree, raised the flag high above his head to inspire his troops on when his thumb was shot off. Without his opposing digit, he could no longer clutch the flag, and down it went once again. When the private picked it up, jumped into the ditches fronting the stockade dam and stabbed the colors into the ground. They were the first Northern colors to reach the parapets of Vicksburg. There, the national colors would be joined by the regimental crest, but only a handful of the regulars made it into the ditch, not enough to try to go over the top and gain the fortification. While the regulars who made it into the ditch were living what one sergeant called a living grave, elsewhere along the line, the men were pinned down well short of their objective. South of the road was a unit, the 55th Illinois Volunteers, led by Colonel Oscar Malmberg. Now, Malmberg was a Swedish immigrant, spoke broken English with a harsh Swedish accent. While as the soldiers were pinned to the ground and hammering away at the Confederates, he realized that his supply of ammunition was getting depleted. Not wishing to pull his troops out of line for fear that it would cause a mass retrograde, he called for volunteers to run to the rear to pick up a fresh supply of munitions, and 4 men volunteered for this hazardous assignment, including a young musician by the name of Orion Howe. As the 4 men raced to the rear, 3 of the 4 were killed outright. The only survivor was Orion Howe, sitting folded in the back of his leg and was toppled hard to the ground. Howe picked himself up, dusted himself off, and continued hobbling down the road when he spotted a familiar figure standing there with binoculars in hand, no less an individual than William T. Sherman, the Corps commander. Well, Howe followed up with Sherman, saluted smartly, and began to recount the situation of the troops out on firing. Now, Sherman was much taller. And gazing down at this young lad, you could tell by the action and reflection on his face, the blood streaming down the back of his leg, that he was badly wounded. Yet he listened intently to Howe's report. And when Howe finished, Sherman ordered him to the rear hospitalization. He said, "I will see to it personally, the young man, that a fresh supply of munitions to carry forward." While Howe continued hobbling to the rear, he suddenly wheeled about and yelled, "54 caliber!" meaning the size of munitions needed at the front. So 54 caliber munitions were gathered. Volunteers from the 11th Iowa Infantry carried those heavy crates forward under a murderous fire of musketry, and as they began distributing the precious cartridges, realized it was the wrong style. But be that as it may, it should not detract from the bravery of this young man. According to in the aftermath of the assault, Sherman, in recounting the bravery of this young lad, thought he deserved recognition and put the boy in for a medal. In time, a medal was authorized, no less than the Medal of Honor. Although the medal was not authorized until 1896, on the day he performed the service for which he received our nation's most coveted award, he was only 14 years of age. And so he is the youngest recipient of the Medal of Honor for action at Vicksburg. 181 Army Medals of Honor, 6 Navy Medals of Honor were awarded for action at Vicksburg, and Howe was the youngest. But it may surprise you, he is not the youngest recipient overall. During the course of the Civil War, 2 12-year-old boys were awarded the Medal of Honor. And to this day, those 2 12-year-olds remain the youngest recipient of our nation's highest award for action. Well, the attack failed. Fortunately, the men of the 1st Battalion managed to reach the ditch and lived in a grave throughout the course of the day, managed to retrieve their colors and fall back. The national colors alone had been pierced by 56 bullet holes. There were 3 bullets and a piece of canister embedded in the flagstaff, attesting to Sergeant Gardner's claim that men never stood a hotter fire. But General William Sherman had been the very first commander of the 1st Battalion, 13th United States Infantry. The unit was referred to as Sherman's Own. And the following day, as Sherman was riding the lines, inspecting his troops, he came to the members of the 1st Battalion and, gazing down at the paucity of their numbers, cried out with tears streaming down his cheeks, "My God, is that all that's left of the 13th Infantry?" Sadly enough, it was. They lost 43% of their men in moving those colors forward on the 400 yards. What Sherman would see to it that his own, as they were was losing recognition. So the aftermath of the siege of Vicksburg, as the battle honors were being awarded, Sherman saw to it that the men of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry, were ordered to inscribe on their battle flag not just Vicksburg, but first at Vicksburg, for being the first unit to reach the enemy's parapets. But so proud were the officers and men of that unit, of that singular army, that they adopted it as their unit motto. To this day, if you ever run into a member of the 13th United States Infantry, currently stationed at Camp Jackson, Columbia, South Carolina, you will proudly see emblazoned on their shoulder patches the inscription, "First at Vicksburg. Well, the attack on the 19th day of May failed. Why? It was the abortine. The obstructions in front of their works that disrupted the Union advance long before it ever reached its objectives. Next slide. In preparation for the attack on May the 22nd, Grant's second assault against the city, Sherman realized that the abortine must be avoided at all costs. This attack is to succeed, but the only avenue of approach takes you right into the enemy's kill zone on the Graveyard Road. He also knows, thanks to the men of the 1st Battalion, that there is a ditch fronting the stockade redan. It measures 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide. It was the last obstacle that had to be overcome if the attack were to succeed. And how do you overcome such an obstacle in the presence of the enemy? Well, Sherman devised the plan. He called for his men to form face scenes. Face scenes are simply bundles of cane tied together, and that would be strict violence around Vicksburg, cane road, whatever they want. So the idea is to form these face scenes of cane, make planks and scaling ladders, and have them carrying these bridging materials, if you will, in front of the assault column. And the idea is once you get to the ditch, throw down the bundles of cane, filling up a portion of the ditch. It could quickly be planked over, scaling ladders thrown against the wall, and the infantry takes assault, race down the Graveyard Road, over planks, up the ladders, over top, and capture Vicksburg. 5%. But as you go to Vicksburg today, the park is covered by a dense forest that was first again planted by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s. There were no trees in the immediate vicinity. Where was Sherman going to get the materials for the planks and the scaling ladders? Well, as he reconnoitered around a mile behind the Union line, he spotted a wooden frame building. And so he called for volunteers, sent them down under cover of darkness to dismantle this building and use those materials for the planks and scaling ladders. Now, if any of you have ever served in the armed forces in the United States, you know the very first thing you learn, don't volunteer for anything. No matter how simple it sounds, you're going to get burned, aren't you? Well, what these volunteers didn't realize, nor did Sherman tell them, was that the house was occupied, not by disloyal citizens, but by no less an individual than Major General Ulysses S. Grant, the Army commander. Sherman didn't have a heart that. So since his volunteers would do the dirty work for him, now you would think that the sentries in front of this building would have notified him. If they get down there and start throwing rocks through the windows, pulling boards off the exterior wall, and Grant was inside at that point in time, sound asleep. You can imagine the consternation of these volunteers when suddenly they heard a very angry yet very familiar voice coming from inside the building, demanding to know what was going on here. And out walked Grant in his night clothes. Well, these guys stuttered their way through an explanation. Grant listened patiently, without commenting on it, left the building and set up his headquarters in the tent where he remained for the duration of the siege. Well, I can sure that building was left in every time after that. Planks and scaling ladders, the basic readiness for the assault by May the 22nd, and 150 men stepped forward to carry these bridging materials. They were dubbed the forlorn hope. That gives you any idea of the chance of success. Well, on the 22nd day of the 1863, more than 220 Union cannon opened fire against the city's fortifications. And for 4 hours, they pummeled those works with solid shotgun shell, tearing large holes in those works, and again, the thick white smoke of the guns shrouding the field. Well, 10 o'clock time, signal was given. The guns fell silent. Surging down the Graveyard Road came these volunteers with the planks, scaling ladders, and facing the field. They made it to what would be known as the kill zone, a road only 100 yards in front of the Confederate works. The Confederates, seeing them, opened fire upon them, toppling scores of the volunteers. But those who were unharmed, true to their mission, reached the ditch, threw down their planks that were put in the bundles of cane that were planked over, scaling ladders swung against the wall. And as they turned to watch the infantry begin its assault, they were shocked when there were no troops in sight. There was a breakdown in communications, and the order had never been relayed to the troops to follow the volunteers. By this time, all the concealing smoke of the guns had risen. The fields were exposed for all to see. Sherman was there. And as the attack was expected, it would be made. And so surging down the Graveyard Road came Sherman's troops once again. Although they succeeded in planting their colors once again on the exterior slopes of the Confederate forts, they would be driven back. In similar fashion, Andrew Percy's corps had from here along Jackson Road to the center of the fence line, reached the Confederate fortifications, planted their colors on the exterior slopes, and they too were driven back at heavy loss. Only square on the south would be troops of the 13th Army Corps and General John McClernand that would actually have a short line penetration at Railroad Redoubt. But by day's end, all along the front, the Federal soldiers were driven back, this time with a loss of more than 3,000 soldiers. As the blue lines receded, they left behind their dead and wounded, which in places covered the ground as neatly as if by a blanket of blue. And there they remained for days, exposed to the sun, and to the rain, the heat, and to the flies. The bodies of the dead began to float and turn black. One Confederate soldier wrote, "The Yanks are trying to stink us out of Vicksburg, the oval of the dead." Finally, on the 25th day of May, either unable or unwilling to stay in that stench any longer, it is the Confederate commander, General John Pembroke, who would send out a flag of truce, imploring, as he put it, in the name of humanity, that Grant bury his dead. Grant would acquiesce and call a truce for 2.5 hours. Until 6 o'clock in the afternoon of the 25th day of May, white flags appeared along the lines. Men in blue and gray mingled between the works. As one soldier noted, over there, a group of 4 played cards, 2 Yanks and 2 Reds, while others swapped tobacco for coffee. While the gruesome task of the burial details went about, it was almost as if there was no war in progress. But at the appointed time, the flags were taken down. Everyone ran to cover. The siege of Vicksburg began in earnest that day. Throughout the month of May and into June, Union soldiers slowly extended their lines to the left and to the right until they completely encircled the city of Vicksburg, cutting Confederate soldiers as well cutting the Confederates off from all supply and communications with the outside world. Once that line of circumvallation, as it was called, was established, Grant ordered his engineering officers to construct approaches, sink approaches, or saps as they were called. 13 approaches would be excavated by the Union soldiers, aimed at those 9 major forts guarding the road entry points into the city of Vicksburg. These approaches were trenches, if you will. They were 7 feet deep, 8 feet wide. 7 feet deep that would accommodate the average man of that time period who would stand fully erect without exposing himself. 8 feet wide would accommodate the forward passage of column of troops, 4 men abreast, would even accommodate the forward passage of wagons and artillery. And so you dig a zig and a zag, a zigzag as they were called, and then a parallel line parallel to that of your enemy. Move up your infantry, move up your artillery, first within 300 yards, then another forward zigzag, a second parallel, moving your infantry and artillery within 200 yards, then 100 yards. And the whole purpose of this digging was to dig all the way up to the Confederate works and then tunnel underneath them. Hollow out rooms filled with black powder, blow the fort sky high, surge into the breach created by the explosion, and hopefully gain access to the city of Vicksburg. Well, that would be the story of the siege of Vicksburg for the next 6 hot, muggy Mississippi weeks. 13 separate approaches would be excavated toward the Confederate works. The most successful which was known as Logan's Approach, that would take place along the center of the Confederate line on the Jackson Road. Known as Logan's Approach, as it was named after Major General John A. Logan, better known as Blackjack Logan, whose troops were actually doing the excavation. And so they would dig this saps, 7 feet deep, 8 feet wide, inching their way forward each day. By June the 22nd, they had managed to reach the Confederate fortification when the digging party, the Tea Party, began excavating a gallery or tunnel underground. This gallery measured only 3 feet by 4 feet. You can imagine working in such cramped conditions, pick and shovel. Fortunately for General Logan, many of the troops in his force were former lead miners from Missouri and Illinois, and these lead miners would actually do the excavation on this gallery. It would extend for 40 feet, and at the end of which you would have galleries going off to either side. Well, by June the 25th, the gallery was complete and would be ready for the mine to be planted. Now, the Confederates knew exactly what was going on. All they did was put here to the ground, they could hear the Union soldiers digging directly beneath their position. And so the Confederates could counteract this digging, excavate what were referred to as counter shafts from behind their own works. These counter shafts went straight down 10, 15, 20 feet. By all accounts, at the bottom of these counter shafts, the air was stifled. It was almost impossible to breathe. And at the bottom of these counter shafts, the Confederates could actually hear the Union soldiers talking opposite them. They could even make out their conversations. But sounds traveled differently below ground than they do on the surface, and although they could hear the Union soldiers digging and talking opposite them, they could not tell from what direction or from what distance the sounds were coming. All they knew that on the 25th day of May, 25th day of June, the digging ops stopped. Which meant only one thing. The mine had been completed, and sure enough it was. On the 25th day of June, Grant ordered the mine planted immediately. 2,200 pounds of black powder were placed in this mine. Detonation was set to 3 o'clock that afternoon. Fuses, by the way, were borrowed from the United States Navy. But just a few minutes before 3 o'clock, Grant arrives on the Jackson Road and dismounts only 125 yards from the Confederate works. There he gives the nod. The fuses were lit and the sparks disappeared into the inky blackness of the tunnel. 3 o'clock came and went. No explosion. 3:05, 3:10, 3:15, 3:20, still nothing. They decided to give it a little bit longer time. You can imagine the volunteers at the head of this assault column wondering when the volunteers were going to be sent in to find out what happened to the fuses. Well, they decided to give it a little bit longer. 3:26, 3:27, still nothing. Suddenly at 3:28 in the afternoon, there came a muffled thud and a loud explosion. And as the dirt began to break apart, you could actually see men in wagons, mules, artillery pieces blown skyward. The mine had gone off with a vengeance. While surging down the Jackson Road came the troops of General 1st and 17th Army Corps. Into the crater they poured, plowing to the left and to the right, trying to exploit the breach in the Confederate works, but to no avail. The Confederates, realizing what was about to transpire, had massed their only available reserve directly behind the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and before the dust even settled, those reserves were sent forward. With the rebel yell ringing in the air, these Confederates slammed into the Federals, and at the point of bayonet, were able to contain their bravery and drive them slowly, inexorably back into the crater itself. There, the battle raged in unabated fury for 26 hours. One sent in one fresh regiment after another, trying to push their way through the Confederate work, all to no avail. As one soldier noted, the crater itself slowly filled with the dead and dying, both armies, men in blue and gray, until it was completely filled. Late the next day, Grant realized his great gamble had failed, and he called his troops back. Well, undaunted by failure here on the 25th day of June, Captain Andy Hickam, chief engineer of the 17th Army Corps, excavated another gallery under what was left of the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and on July the 1st, a second mine was detonated. It's a little small, only 1,800 pounds of powder. But Confederates, once again, knowing what was about to transpire, sank counter shafts from within their works. Not wishing to lose additional irreplaceable white soldiers, they placed 7 blacks down in these counter shafts under the command of a Confederate corporal. And on July the 1st, when the mine was detonated, 6 of these blacks and the Confederate corporal were buried by the explosion. But one of the blacks, a slave named Abraham, was actually blown skyward and landed behind Union lines. I mean, you can imagine these Union soldiers under arms. Well, by all accounts, this man landed on his head, yet he was completely unscathed, not a scratch on him. Some Union soldiers quickly raced up to this man, picked him up, dusted him off. One even had the audacity to ask, "How high to go?" To which this man responded, "Oh, right, you know the thing 3 miles." I'm sure it felt that way. But this man was an instant celebrity. He was taken back and introduced to Governor First and to General Grant. And for a few remaining days of the siege, this man was actually sequestered in a tent where some enterprising Union soldiers actually charged 25 cents admission for curious soldiers just to talk. The man who had been blown to freedom. Disease, as you might imagine, began to spread rapidly through the Confederate ranks. This is diarrhea, malaria, various fevers, they all took a heavy toll of human life and were far more certain of death than were the Union sharpshooters that ringed the city. At first, scores, then hundreds of men could be seen to lay aside their weapons and walk or crawl as best they could into the hospitals in town. But even there was no succors. Medical supplies were in short supply. Confederate rations were cut initially to 3/4 ration, then to half, then to quarter, and they were cut again, and yet again, and yet again. By the end of June, the garrison of Vicksburg was subsisting on a handful of peas and rice issued once a day per man. There was not very much to maintain their strength upon, but it was all they had. Each and every day, the dead wagons, as it came to be known, would make their rounds to the hospitals, and the dead were brought out in ever-increasing number and stacked as cordwood in the wagons and carried to their long eternal rest and interred in the city cemetery north of town. By the end of June, John Pemberton realized that time was fast expiring. On July 2nd, take it back, July 1st, he sends out a confidential circular to his subordinate officers, asking them what the condition of the troops under their command was. Could these men undergo the necessities and hardships required of a breakout attempt? He received his replies on July 2nd. All were in the negative. In fact, many of his subordinates recommended the time for surrender had come. Pemberton, in reviewing the situation, said, "I fully concur in the estimate of this council and will propose to surrender this city." He said, the northerner by birth, he said, "I know my people," being the northerner. He said they are vain, glorious, and egotistical lot, and they would give anything if the city were to be surrendered on July the 4th. And so on July the 3rd, a white flag of truce appeared along the lines, and riding out from the city came a cavalcade of officers led by John Pemberton. Riding to meet him was a much larger cavalcade of officers in blue, led by Ulysses S. Grant. The two generals met between the lines, dismounted and sat in the shade of the stunted oak. At which time Pemberton asked Grant on what terms he would receive the surrender of the city and garrison under his command, to which Grant replied, "I have no terms but an immediate and unconditional surrender of the city." Well, these terms were unacceptable for John Pemberton, who very angrily shook his finger in Grant's face and said, "I can assure you then, General, you'll bury many more of your men before you ever enter into the city of Vicksburg." And he tried to convince Grant that he had ample quantities of food and munitions left to enable him to withstand siege indefinitely. The only thing these two generals could agree upon was a cessation of hostilities and the pledge they continued to exchange the notes until suitable terms could be worked out. Early on the morning of July 4th, Grant sent in his final amended terms. Rather than call for an unconditional surrender of the city, he offered parole to the garrison. Now, what is a parole? During the course of the Civil War, both sides captured large numbers of men and soldiers, taking care of prisoners for war-proof taxing for the administration in Washington as well as that in Richmond. And so they entered into an agreement called the Dix Hill Cartel, which called for an equal exchange of prisoners, man for man, rank for rank. They even had the ratio where a general officer would be the equivalent of 60 privates. And there were a lot of privates incensed by that exchange ratio, I can assure you. Well, by signing your parole, you're making an oath not to take alarm against the federal government until properly exchanged. Pemberton received these and realized they were the best terms that could be had. So at 10 o'clock in the morning of July the 4th, white flags appeared along the lines once again, marching out from the defenses for the Confederate soldiers who had so valiantly defended the city for such a long period of time. In front of their works, they stacked their flags and accoutrements, turned over their equipment, and a victorious Union army would march in and take possession of the city of Vicksburg. General Grant himself would ride down to the city to walk out here to see the one-pound courthouse in the background. Victorious Union troops entering the city of Vicksburg on July 4th. Grant would ride down to the city's waterfront and personally thank and congratulate Admiral David Porter for the assistance rendered by the Navy. And Grant would be the first to admit he could never have taken Vicksburg without the Navy's assistance. Almost as an afterthought, he could send a note to President Abraham Lincoln in Washington informing the commander-in-chief that Vicksburg had fallen. It would take several days for this note to reach Washington, and in the interim, the Battle of Gettysburg is fought July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, resulting in Union victory. And Port Hudson, Louisiana, the only remaining Confederate bastion on the Mississippi River, would surrender to Union General Nathaniel Banks. And so in very quick order, President Lincoln would receive three glorious pieces of news: victory at Gettysburg, victory at Port Hudson, and victory at Vicksburg. And he would simply sigh, thank God, the Father of waters again flows unvexed to the sea. A major objective of the overall Union grand strategy had been achieved. The Confederacy was now cut in two along the line of the Mississippi, trapped in the coils of the giant anaconda. The South would slowly be strangled into submission. And although the war would last for another 18 months and tens of thousands of American soldiers in Union blue and Confederate bravery died on bloody fields of battle, as of July of 1863, it was pretty apparent for all concerned that the Union would be preserved. And with that, I thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Okay, questions, sir?
So you mentioned General Washington's grandson.
Grandnephew, grandnephew.
Grandnephew. What happened to him in the battle of the ditches?
Captain Washington would be mortally wounded on May 19th. As he led his regulars over that fence and down into the ravines where they encountered obstruction and felled trees, he was clambering over another post and rail fence down at the bottom of the ravine when he took a mini ball and hit him mortally wounded. As he fell to the ground, his second in command, Captain Charles Hewitt, brother-in-law William T. Sherman, raced over to catch the captain's dying words. And as Washington unbuckled his sword belt and turned his pocket watch over to Hewitt, he said, "Make sure our colors reach the enemy works." Well, unfortunately for Captain Washington, he perished on the field of battle. His body was never recovered, at least not by the Union soldiers. That evening, the Confederates sent out these incendiary devices, flares, if you will, to illuminate the area in front of their works, to prevent the Federal soldiers from consolidating their position close to the Confederate lines. And they saw men of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry down in that ravine, and they yelled out to them, "We have your captain, and he's dying." Well, Captain Washington would die, evidently the Confederates buried him somewhere behind their works. His body has never been recovered, or is never identified as such.
Sir, why did Pemberton hold out so long if he knew that there was not going to be any support or rescue operations coming from the east or the south?
Why did Pemberton hold out so long?
In other words,
Now, Vicksburg,
he would have known that it was a lost cause unless he was relieved somehow.
yeah,
He
now,
had to have some sort
well,
of.
correct. Now, Pemberton realized that the city of Vicksburg was of such significance to the Confederates that surely some relief operation would be launched. And true enough, there was. Jefferson Davis would order General Joseph E. Johnston to Mississippi, where he would organize what became known as the Army of Relief. The whole purpose of this Army of Relief was to march on Vicksburg, break through Grant's encircling army, and rescue the garrison of Vicksburg. But quite frankly, Joseph Johnston had no intention of fighting against U.S. Grant, and he would watch as the weeks slowly passed. He would be urged by Davis, as well as Secretary of War James A. Seddon, none more boisterous than James A. Seddon. He said, "The honor of the Confederacy forbids that Vicksburg be lost without a gallant effort on your part." But nothing could spur Johnston into order to move. But Johnston and Pemberton, they had some communications between the two, but those communications became less and less frequent as the Union cordon around the city of Vicksburg became tighter. The last communication that John Pemberton received from Joseph E. Johnston was dated June 23rd, in which he asked Pemberton where would be the best place to attack. Now, for Johnston to even ask that question shows that he's not doing any reconnaissance whatsoever. Pemberton would reply that I can hold out 15 days longer if there's any chance of relief. Let's do some math. It's June the 23rd. It will take 4 days for that note to reach Jackson, break out through the Union lines and reach Jackson. Johnston would wait another precious day before he issued orders to begin the movement the following day on July 1st. So as Johnston finally moves on to Jackson on July the 1st, he's slowly winding his way toward Vicksburg, the vanguard arriving on the line of the Big Black River just 9 miles east of Vicksburg, when he realizes that the firing in Vicksburg had stopped, which meant only one thing: Vicksburg had surrendered. Johnston, to his dying day, would fault John Pemberton for not holding out the 15 days. He held out 12 days, not 15. But on the 12th day, after not hearing anything from Johnson, realizing that he has been abandoned by the government, abandoned by Joseph B. Johnson, with the Federals on the verge of detonating 13 mines underneath his works, Pemberton thought it would be best to try to get some good terms. So finally, on July the 3rd, he would open up communications with Grant. Now, to his dying day, Joe Johnson would place the responsibility for the fall of Vicksburg on John Pemberton. To his dying day, John Pemberton would blame Joseph B. Johnston, as to with Jefferson Davis. An interesting story, in the aftermath of the fall of Vicksburg, Pemberton is paroled. And as he's heading eastward, passing Jackson, going over to Morton, Mississippi, he finds Joseph B. Johnston. He's ordered to report to his military superior, Johnston. He reaches Morton, Mississippi. Johnston is sitting on the front porch of a house, sitting in a rocking chair, and he sees a solitary horseman arrive at the gate, and he recognizes him as John Pemberton. So Johnston jumps out of the chair, races down the walk, extends his hand, says, "Jack, my boy, it's good to see you." Pemberton coldly salutes and said, "General Johnston, by the term of my parole, I am to report to you, I have done so." Closed his salute, turned, mounted, and rode away. The two men never saw one another again. Jefferson Davis would clearly place the fall of Vicksburg, the blame for that on Joseph B. Johnson. Sir.
Once Grant crossed the Mississippi from the western bank, how was he supplied? Was the Mississippi clear down the north?
The Mississippi is clear all the way northward. No supplies will be coming up south because you still have Confederates at Fort Hudson, Louisiana. So all these supplies came down the Mississippi River to Milliken's Bend and Young's Point. That's north of and on the opposite side of Vicksburg. There, those supplies were unloaded, placed on wagon, sent by wagon road south of Vicksburg, where they were once again placed on boarders, transports, and gunboats, and ferried down to Grand Gulf. Now, as Grant's army approaches Vicksburg, you recall that he drives Pemberton's army back into the city of Vicksburg. As a result, Grant is able to reestablish contact with the fleet on the Yazoo River north of Vicksburg. And so he reestablishes contact with the fleet right there by Chickasaw Bayou, where Sherman had met with defeat in December of 1862. And supposedly he turned to Sherman and said, "I am now in possession of the most valuable real estate in the Confederacy." Because by being there overlooking the Yazoo River, he has now assured himself of an uninterrupted line of supply and communication via the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers. So throughout the long course of the siege, Grant had no problem whatsoever replenishing supplies of food, clothing, medicine, and ammunition. Okay.
Richard McMurray, in his recent book on Johnson, makes the argument that once the Union fleet had passed Vicksburg, holding Vicksburg was completely irrelevant.
For all intents and purposes, Richard is correct.
I was really curious what you thought.
But you recall when Pemberton, prior to being named the commander of the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana, had been commander of the Department of South Carolina and Georgia, headquartered in Charleston. Now, what Pemberton wanted to do, knowing his paucity of forces, was to abandon the coastal area, consolidate his available manpower in the interior, what the Army would call choke points. There, meet the enemy's invasion, drive them back into the ocean. Among the areas he wanted to abandon was no less a symbol than Fort Sumter. Now, that did not sit well with the mayor of Charleston, let alone Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina. And they voiced their opposition and complaint to President Davis loud and clear. So Davis would send Lee, Robert E. Lee, his military advisor, to Charleston to counsel with Pemberton. And Lee would tell him that Charleston is of such importance to the Confederacy that it must be defended at all hazards. Fight, quote, street by street, house by house, if need be. But Charleston must be held. But by that time, the writing's on the wall, Pemberton has to go. So they move him over to the Department of Mississippi in East Louisiana, which at that point in time was a relatively quiet sector, charged with the responsibility of holding Vicksburg and Fort Hudson. Now, if you're John Pemberton and you have just been admonished by Robert E. Lee, speaking on behalf of Jefferson Davis, to hold Vicksburg at all hazards, how are you going to do it? By doing street by street, house by house, if need be. So Pemberton is tethered to Vicksburg, and that will prove his downfall.
Can I do a quick follow-up,
Sure.
Mr. President? His commander, direct commander, was Johnson, was defeated.
He's Peter Pan, right?
And Johnson, I believe, ordered him to get out of
He
Vicksburg.
did, he did.
But Pemberton didn't.
Now, John Pemberton falls back after the disasters of Champion Hill and Big Black River. He falls back into Vicksburg. And Pemberton notifies Joseph E. Johnson, his military superior, of his action. Johnson immediately tells him, get out, get out.
You'll be trapped there and you'll be
That's
screwed.
exactly. We cannot save both Vicksburg and the Army. And of the two, the Army is more important. Pemberton sends him a note saying, I don't think you fully appreciate the significance of the city I'm charged with defending. My orders from a higher authority, the Confederate president, is to hold Vicksburg at all hazards, and I intend to follow that order. And
He was in Iraq.
yes, it was. And as soon as Johnson receives Pemberton's note saying, I'm going to stay in Vicksburg and wait to leave, I can take Johnson fights him off. Yes, sir.
What do you think a little bit on
Naval forces, how do they communicate? Way back. Way back. You had a number of signal towers directly along the Union line. So, and by that signal tower, they were what in that time period referred to as instantaneous communications. So it was by wave. Now, the Confederates, who had their own signal stations throughout the Vicksburg area, had one signal station in a couple of the courthouse. And they watched the Union signaling between the Union Army and the Union Navy, and very early on broke their signal code. So no sooner did Grant send a note to Porter, the Confederates knew exactly what he was asking and what Porter's reply was. So on July the 3rd, after that meeting, face-to-face meeting, Grant and Pemberton, Grant would ride back to his headquarters and he would wag a note to Admiral Porter asking him if he had enough vessels at his disposal to transport the garrison of Vicksburg northward to prison camp. Porter wig-wagged back, no, I do not. And it was Porter's recommendation that the general offer parole instead. So no sooner did Grant receive Porter's reply, John Pemberton knew that Grant was going to change his tune, his terms from unconditional surrender to
were those towers considered all places for attack?
Oh, no, sir, not at all. If they were within range of your artillery, you go out. Sure you would. Man,
I thank you first of all for your comments. This is very just a I have a question about range early on in Vicksburg, and that is to say, we tend to do some of our experiences, yes, and with that introduction, I'm looking at a bit of where you've been up until that point. So I'm curious, from your point of view, given that you've studied this for so long, as expertise, do you see the grants innovation there along the way? Do you see that as a great innovation? Do you see this? I see it as straight almost to stop. And his experience with God.
I tell folks all the time that Grant, unlike so many, Grant is a three-dimensional thing. Although he's on the West Point and schooled and dominant as were all these other officers, Grant was not outside the box. He wasn't wedded to Dominion theory. As a result, Grant was able to think outside the box and find and realize that there's more than the standard way of approaching something. I refer to Grant as the first American modern president.
Yeah.
Now, I do an entire talk on Grant and applicability in the modern age. And take a look at FN 100-5, which is the Army's field manual on offensive operations, where they talk about the principles of war and so on, the power of the offense and so on. And they are describing, in fact, in their 1986 edition of FN 100-5, they highlight the Vicksburg campaign as an example of highly successful offensive operations and offensive operations to be emulated on the modern field and battlefields of the 21st century. So Grant is a modern warrior by any definition, far more so than any of his contemporaries, including Robert. Oh, there can be no doubt. Scott was innovative. Grant was innovative. One thing about Grant was his perseverance, his dogged tenacity. Grant, as you recall, had been a failure most of his life. He resigned from the Army and he bounced from job to job, finding resources, selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis just to support his family. So Grant had been a failure most of his life, and when he finally gets back into the Army, he makes a determination he is not going. Okay. he's going to persevere. And there's that dogged tenacity coupled with his flexibility that are his keys to success during the course of the Civil War. Sir?
Terrence, you mentioned that the Camden Hill was the key to the campaign. What was the key to the Union victory?
The key to the Union victory at Champion Hill was Grant was able to mass superior numbers on the front. Now, Pemberton, realizing what Grant's intention was of getting astride that railroad to separate his line of supply and communication, Pemberton, based on the urging of his subordinate officers, who in most cases are far more aggressive than is the commanding general himself, he will move beyond the Big Black River. Now, Pemberton has a force of approximately 30,000 soldiers in Vicksburg. It's spaced out of 5 divisions. He will take 3 of his 5 divisions out in the field to battle Grant, leaving 2 divisions behind in Vicksburg to safeguard the river batteries in case the United States Navy attempts a landing on the Vicksburg waterfront. And so by moving out with only 3 of his 5 divisions, Pemberton assures himself numeric inferiority. Grant, on the other hand, has 7 divisions concentrating on the Edwards area. Vast superiority of infantry as well as firepower in terms of artillery. And Grant has his forces well in hand. So there's unity of command among the Union Army at Champion Hill. That's not the case in the Confederate ranks. In fact, Pemberton's chief subordinate officer at the Battle of Champion Hill, W.W. Loring, is in open feuding with John Pemberton. One of his staff officers writes that it was common knowledge throughout the Army that Loring would risk a defeat of the Army if it resulted in John Pemberton's removal. And so there's no unity of command among the Confederate forces at Champion Hill, and it leads to confusion, and that confusion leads to defeat. Yes, sir.
Sir, would you speak briefly, if necessary, about the experience of the residents of
Sure. The city of Vicksburg, now I mentioned the city of Vicksburg was a city of 5,000 souls at the outbreak of the Civil War. How many of them remained behind during the course of the siege, we don't know. We estimate 2,000, maybe 2,500. And these people would be forced to live underground in man-made caves to escape the constant bombardment of Union cannon and heavy mortars. Although they would resort to living in caves underground like rats for weeks on end, there were civilian casualties as well as fatalities. We know there were at least 100 casualties among the civilian population, probably somewhere around between 15 and 50 fatalities. Now, the Vicksburg newspaper was actually printed during the course of the siege on wallpaper, and it's from these few wallpaper editions of Vicksburg paper where they list the names of the people who were killed or injured, that were able to glean those numbers, but it wasn't printed on a daily basis. So we know that a minimum of 100 casualties, a minimum somewhere between 50 and 50 civilians were killed. So in Vicksburg, more so than in any other American city, north or south, the citizens experienced war in all its forms. Now the caves, these are man-made caves. In the early part of the 20th century, there were a number of children suffocated in cave-ins. These caves left over from the Civil War were favorite playgrounds for kids. And oftentimes these caves would collapse and children were suffocated. Consequently, a city ordinance was passed and all the caves that could be located were either filled in or had their entrances collapsed. But there are still a few caves that I know about and have been in the Vicksburg area. Now, all very dangerous, mind you, but there are still some exits. If no further questions, folks, I thank you so very much.